Okay, all right. So we're going to begin now. First of all, I would like to thank everyone for being here today once again for our series of talk. And it is a great honor to open this event today. Part of the series, Reading and Interfaces, Theories, Methods, and Applications, celebrating the 50th anniversary of our postgraduate program in English, PPGE, which was founded in 1971. And this virtual event is organized by NEL, Núcleo de Estudos em Leitura, under my coordination, and GEMP, Grupo de Estudos em Neurolinguística e Psicolinguística, coordinated by Lilian Christine Ubner, with the support of our graduate program in English. So I would like to thank Professor Marcel Just for having accepted to our invitation and to share his expertise in the area here with us today. So thank you very much, Marcel. I'm just gonna give the floor to Lilian so that she can say a few words and then.
Yes, thank you, Leda. Well, thank you, Dr. Just. Thank you a lot for having accepted our invitation. It's really a great honor having you here. Thank you for having found a slot in your agenda to share with us a little bit of your knowledge. We have read a lot of your publications, many of your publications. We are very much acquainted with your studies, and we are very happy to know about this new trend of studies, which is very, very exciting, and it's a very new topic. Yeah, and so we are really willing to listen to you, very excited with your presence, virtual presence here among us. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Marcel has been to Brazil, to UFSC. I think that was for Augusto Boukvait's doctoral defense. And that was 2006, if I'm not mistaken. So a long, long time ago. So I hope we have the chance to have you here in person again. But so I'm just, of course, we would have a lot to say about Dr. Marcel Just, but he is a DOAB professor of psychology. He's the director of the Center for Cognitive Brain Imaging at Carnegie Mellon University in the USA. So his current research develops and tests theories of how we neurally represent individual concepts and larger units of knowledge. And he's going to talk about this here today, right? So the main basic approach applies machine learning and factor analysis to fMRI data. And the two applications that are being explored are the use of altered concept representations to identify people with suicidal ideation, and the learning of new technical concepts in work and college settings. So very new trend work, something very new. And we are very pleased to have you here. Okay, Marcel. And I think I have to say that your lab was one of the first labs working with fMRI, right, Marcel? Back in 1994, 95?
Started doing, the first experiment was in 94 or 5.
Yeah. So thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. And with no further ado, Marcel, the floor is yours. Okay, thank you very much. We are now going to close our cameras so that you can just see Marcel in these slides. Yes, thank you.
Okay, it's an honor to be invited here. I've had lots of contact with the Federal University of Santa Catarina that I hope has been mutually beneficial and interesting. And I'm glad to have this opportunity to tell you about this work. I know that this group, that your group is sort of interdisciplinary. It's not just one perspective. And I think this work that I'm going to describe is interdisciplinary. You see, the title of my talk is, it's about brain imaging. I underlined the brain's code for representing concepts. But I think at the heart of this work is to understand how we represent meaning. And I want to argue that meaning really comes from the brain. And when I say that, what I mean is that the framing of meaning, the infrastructure of meaning, comes from the brain. That Mother Nature gives us an apparatus with which to think, to conceive of the world, and we can read about it, we can talk about it, we can think about it, but we're always using this machinery that Mother Nature gave us. And you see this, I'll tell you about this universality of how we read, speak, listen, think in the terms that Mother Nature gave us, how meaning is organized by the biology of the brain. That's sort of my main theme. And you know, there's obviously a neuroscience component to get at this organization. There's some educational implications of it and so on. But meaning is at the heart. I think the word meaning doesn't occur in any one of my slides. It's not popular to use the word meaning because it's sort of too ephemeral and non-scientific, but that's really what it is. So this is just a point about Zoom. I'm sure you're all extremely experienced at using Zoom. I want to point out that often the view options, you know, under the Zoom, under the screen sharing thing, my favorite one is side-by-side mode, where you see the slide and me and maybe the other participants. But as I said, if you're experienced and have another preference, feel free to use it. This is the one I sometimes recommend to audiences, the side-by-side mode under view options. Okay, let me just foreshadow some of the key ideas of this talk. Let me start by saying that every concept has a decodable neural signature, the brain activation pattern. If you think of a dog right now, something happens in your brain, and it's the same thing in every member of the audience. We all experience the same activation pattern when we think of a dog. I'll explain how that is and why that is. My second point is that this brain activation pattern, it's similar, but it could be similar and arbitrary, just a bunch of firings here and there in the brain, but that's not true. It has a systematic structure. You can decompose it. It has identifiable components. And those components, I'll describe them in various instances. They correspond to various brain subsystems. Well, a trivial one is the visual aspect, what a dog looks like. One component of the representation of a dog is what a dog looks like, and that's in the secondary visual areas of the brain. The third point, which I found slightly surprising, not anymore, is that, as I told you, the neural representations of concepts are similar across people and across languages. So it's because we all have the same brain, just the way we all have the same legs and livers and so on, and all of our livers operate approximately similarly. Similarly, our brains are organized similarly. Maybe the main point, perhaps the most interesting that I want to focus on, excuse me, is that there are underlying dimensions of meaning, of knowledge, that organize knowledge in a particular domain. And you can think of these as basis vectors, if you like to think mathematically. For example, for simple narrative sentences, for a sentence like the doctor drove the car through the park, the underlying dimensions are people and social interactions, a spatial setting, actions, and feelings. These are the dimensions that the brain uses to organize a sentence like that. Yes. And each of these dimensions has a neural signature, and you can read it off, and you can tell what the person's thinking or reading. And this approach scales to larger mental structures, as I said, not just single concepts, sentences like the example I gave you in short texts. So this is an overview of the main points, but let me build up to it from first principles. I'll also talk about applications because it's really fair. I think this is very scientifically interesting, but you could say, so what, who cares? But it has educational applications and clinical applications. I'll be talking about those. So here's some technical points. I just want to give you some definitions. I'll be dealing with voxels, and a voxel is a volume element. You all probably know what a pixel is, on your screen, and it's, 1 millimeter by 2 millimeters or whatever. But this is a pixel, but it also has depth. So it's a voxel, a volume element. And we will be using primarily voxels that are 3 by 3 by 6 millimeters. So each one is about the size of a peppercorn. Well, you can imagine what 3 by 3 by 6 millimeters is. And a brain is composed of about 20,000 of them. I'll also be talking about voxels that are stable in a particular experiment, meaning that they're reliable and they have a repeatable semantic tuning curve. The meanings that they respond to. And when I say respond to, I mean their activation level, really the amount of neural firing within the voxel for a particular element of meaning. And I'll be talking about the neural representation of a concept. I have referred to that. And that a neural representation of a concept, in my terms here, is the activation level of about 120 voxels that are stable, that are reliable. And if you tell me the activation level of 120 voxels, I can tell you whether you're thinking of a hammer or an apple or a car or a carrot. I can distinguish between those concepts based on the activation levels of 120 stable voxels. So let me start with these concrete objects. This was published in Science in 2008. We showed people 60 words, 60 concepts, things like leg, chair, car, bottle, screwdriver, carrot, pants, igloo, spoon. They'd be lying in the scanner. They'd see a word on a screen behind them, and they were told to think of the meaning and properties of the named concept. And what we do is we use a statistical procedure, a machine learning procedure called classification. And this classifier, which I'll describe in a second, accurately identifies which of the 60 concepts the person is thinking about from the brain activation pattern. In this case, it obtains a rank accuracy of 0.72, which I'll explain in a minute. What it does is, for any given item, while the person's thinking about it, the classifier takes its guess of what the person's thinking about. It says, my first guess is, say, apple. My second guess is train. My third guess, and so on. It takes 60 guesses. And if it were perfect, of course, it would get it on the first guess, which it occasionally, but really seldom does. And if it knew nothing, if it were just totally random, it would get the correct answer in the 30th position out of 60 on average. And we normalize this so it's not dependent on the number of 60, but we say that if it's random and it gets it at the 30th rank, we say that's a normalized rank accuracy of 0.5 in the middle of the list. meaning it knows nothing, it's just guessing. And here the normalized rank accuracy is 0.72, which is about halfway between random and perfect. The way this is done is it's called training the classifier. We give the classifier labeled data. We say, this image is from Hammer, and we present the list 6 times, and we give it labeled data from 4 of the 6 presentations. We hold out 2 of the remaining presentations, and then when it comes to the test time, we say, here's an image from 2 unlabeled presentations. Can you tell what it is? And it takes its 60 guesses. So I told you the mean rank accuracy was 0.72. Every single participant was decoded reliably above chance level at p less than 0.01, far above statistical chance. 2 of the participants were at 0.84, which is very high. And this, as I told you, was done like 13, 14 years ago. And our improved methods now can routinely get mean accuracies around 0.8 to 0.85 in many such studies. So the thought of a concept is identifiable from its neural signature. It also works across participants, as I indicated in my introduction. If we train the classifier on the data of 10 of the 11 participants, it can tell what the 11th participant is thinking. And it happens that it's equally accurate when it's trained on other people or on the owner of the signature himself or herself. And this works across participants who speak different languages, even monolinguals. And actually, I should mention that we tested this on Portuguese monolinguals from Brazil. This was Cynthia Baylor's contribution. It was the concepts, not the words, that are neurally represented in all of us. So it doesn't matter whether you use the English word for apple or the Portuguese word for apple, the same activation pattern occurs in the brain because these are encoded in the universal language of the brain. And as I said, the encoding is the sum of the encodings of the relevant individual brain regions or systems. For an apple, it's what it looks like, how you hold it, how you bite into it, what it tastes like, and so on. Now, so I've told you how to identify individual concepts, but I think there's something more interesting, and that's what are the dimensions of organization of meaning in the brain. You know, in a dictionary, it's the alphabet, and that would be ridiculous in the brain. It's obviously not alphabetical. So what is it? We want to find out what are the dimensions of organization of these, in this case, of these 60 concepts. So what we do is we do a factor analysis, a dimension reduction of the activation patterns for these 60 words, for these 60 concepts. And the factor analysis gives us a list of factors that are, you know, the lower dimensions. Like in this case, I guess I'm going to be discussing the four lowest dimensions that organize the activation. So, you know, the challenge here is to correctly interpret each factor. And let me ask you, what do you think underlies the representation of concrete objects? Color, shape, size, weight? How do you think a dictionary, besides alphabetic organization, what does a dictionary say about a hammer or an apple? So to go back to the methodology a tiny bit. So the factor analysis gives us a set of factors. It also gives us a factor score for each of the 60 items for each factor. It tells us whether an item such as apple is high or low on a given factor. And so this is extremely helpful in interpreting what the factors are, because the factor analysis absolutely does not provide the interpretation. It says, here's factor 1, here's factor 2, here's factor 3, and good luck figuring out what they are. but this is how we figure out what they are. We see what lies at the extremes of the factor, which items lie at the extreme, and I'll show you those in a minute. And we see which part of the brain the voxels, where the voxels live that code those items at the extreme, the factor loadings for each of the voxels. So let me show you how we interpret each factor. I hope maybe you've had a time to generate your own guesses about what the underlying factors might be. Oh, so this is again, so for the concrete objects, there are three main dimensions of representation: shelter and closure versus open space, body-object interaction, manipulation by the body, and eating, drinking. So I don't think you would find this in a dictionary. When you look up hammer in a dictionary, I doubt that any dictionary says you hold the hammer with your dominant hand and you bend at the elbow using your bicep to move the hammer up and down. I bet no dictionary says that, but that's how your brain codes a hammer. It also codes other things, but I wanted to give you an example of what the brain's dimensions are, as opposed to, you know, a library science dimension or a dictionary dimension. So let me show you. So I've told you that one of the factors is the body-object interaction. Here is called manipulation. And I'm going to show you the words, the concepts that lie at the extreme of each of these dimensions. So, but the dimensions, one is manipulation, how your body interacts with the object. The other is shelter or enclosure. And another one is eating. Word length is another factor that emerges in the visual part of the brain. It's not semantically interesting, but I call it a sanity check because you really want this to work. You really want it to identify words that are similar visually. So I'll show you that. Oh, while we're on here, the sanity check is word length. The words that come up at the extreme of this dimension are the longest word, like butterfly, screwdriver, and refrigerator. And what's at the other end of this dimension, which I don't show, are the shortest words like ant, A-N-T, and bee, B-E-E. So we see that this factor analysis delivers a sensible ordering of the items with respect to some dimension. This isn't a psychologically interesting dimension. It's visually interesting, not psychologically. Let's look at manipulation, body-object interaction. What comes up at the top of the dimension are the tools: pliers, saw, screwdriver, hammer. We never told our analysis program we have tools in here. It just picked out tools. It just picked out this factor. It said some of these items can be organized with respect to this factor, which I won't name. You have to figure out the name, and we figured out this name because it had tools in it. And I'll show you why it's a manipulation factor. One reason is because of what items come out the extreme. The other reason is where the voxels live that code these items. I'll show that to you in a minute. Another factor is shelter or enclosure. So at the top of this list, the most associated items with this factor is apartment, church, train, and house. It obviously is a shelter or enclosure factor. And I'll show you again where the voxels in the brain are that code these items. The third factor is related to eating, and here you see the edible items, vegetables and fruits come out at the top here: carrot, lettuce, tomato, and celery. So this is why one of the reasons we interpret the factors as we do. Here's the other reason. Let me talk about the manipulation factor. The manipulation factor, the voxels live in the left, exclusively in the left hemisphere, which control the dominant hand of our right-handed subjects. So it's motor and premotor areas. When you think about a hammer, you think about wielding the hammer with your motor system and with your dominant hand only. All our subjects were right-handed. The shelter items, the voxels that coded the shelter items were in a brain region called the parahippocampal place area. It was a location in the brain that lights up, that gets activated when subjects are shown pictures of houses or shelters. We didn't show them any pictures. We just showed them words like train and apartment and igloo, and this is what lit up. So I think from the point of view of reading or meaning or brain representation, I think this is the interesting part, that these are the factors that are used to code concrete objects. And I hope you're persuaded that if I were suddenly to show you a soccer ball, the motor brain area that controls your dominant leg would activate. And more generally, I want to say that the brain is organized to help you deal with, to enable you to deal with the world. And that's exactly what it uses to code meaning. Oh, we can validate this. We develop a statistical predictive model of activation patterns based on people's ratings of the items. We, for example, ask an independent group of subjects to rate hammer on a 7-point scale with respect to how salient manipulation is. So we get a set of ratings of all of the 60 items on the 3 dimensions as we interpret them. And then we use those ratings in a fair way to predict the activation of the item, and it can do it very accurately. So this is a validation of this model. This is just a picture of where these voxels live. I think the main thing I want to remind you of in this picture is that each of the factors has more than one location in the brain, 3 or 4, in fact. So there's a motor and a premotor area for coding how you interact with the object physically. So this is just a clip from an American TV show, 60 Minutes.
Neuroscience research into how we think and what we're thinking is advancing at a stunning rate, making it possible for the first time in human history to peer directly into the brain to read out the physical makeup of our thoughts. Some would say to read our minds. Whatever you want to call it, what neuroscientist Marcel Just and his colleague Tom Mitchell at Carnegie Mellon University have done is combine fMRI's ability to look at the brain in action. Think about a screwdriver, and the computer found the place in the brain where that person was thinking screwdriver?
Screwdriver isn't one place in the brain, it's many places in the brain. When you think of a screwdriver, you think about how you hold it, how you twist it, what it looks like, what you use it for.
And each of those functions are in different places?
Correct. And we found that we could identify which object they were thinking about from their brain activation patterns.
You're reading their mind.
We're identifying the thought that's occurring.
Inside the scanner, Megan was shown a series of 10 items and asked to think for a few seconds about each one. If within minutes, the computer, unaware of what pictures Megan had been shown and working only from her brain activity patterns as read out by the scanner, was ready to tell us in its own voice what it believed was the first object Megan had been thinking about.
I think the word is knife. All right, 1.
Bingo. All right, then the second.
I think the word is hammer. All right. I think the word is window.
It's perfect, right?
So far.
And it continued to be, word after word.
Apartment. 10 out of 10.
10 out of 10. Well done, well done.
So I just want to point out that that woman who went into the scanner in the red dress was the associate producer of the program, of the TV program, but our computer program had no knowledge of her activation, and it was trained exclusively on the activation patterns of students at the university. So I see that I'm running, I don't know how this happened, but I'm sort of running behind. I want to tell you this also works on identifying emotions. If we ask people to think about different, evoke an emotion in themselves, anger, disgust, envy, fear, happiness, lust, also a kind of meaning that we have in our brain. We know when we're feeling envy or sadness and so on. And there's a brain activation pattern that uniquely identifies each one. Again, it's common across people. When you feel anger, which I'm sure is a very personal feeling, nevertheless, the activation pattern in your brain for anger is very similar to mine and everybody else's. I think that's a little surprising. The commonality is even higher than for concrete objects. We represent anger more similarly than we represent apple and hammer. But let me get to the meaning. What are the elements of meaning of an emotion? It's valence, the goodness or badness of it. Happy is good, sad is bad. It's arousal or intensity or preparation for action. So the difference between annoyed and furious, they're both kind of on the anger side, but one is intense and one isn't. And some of them involve a social interaction, like another person involved. To be envious, you have to have another person involved, but sadness, you can be sad all by yourself. So this shows us how emotions are represented in our brains along these various dimensions of meaning, I would call them. This is a study. Oh, and this is a study that Cynthia Baylor was a co-author on. This is the sentences like the engineer walked in the peaceful park, and the dog broke the television, the wealthy author walked into the office. And what would the underlying dimensions be for sentences like this? What are, if somebody were reading this or listening to this, what are the underlying dimensions? And here are the underlying dimension: people, places, actions, and feelings. So for example, people, I glibly put a single word, but it's the brain's social processing area. Right inferior frontal gyrus activates when you read a sentence about a person doing something. Places, again, it's going to be the parahippocampal place area. If it's a park or a forest or whatever, that's where it's coded. Actions, if it's a motor action, it's going to be in the motor areas. And feelings, if it's an emotion, I've already told you how that's coded. So as you read a sentence like this, you get these elements of meaning. And just as you can identify whether a person's thinking about a hammer or an apple, you can also tell which sentence they're thinking about. So here, for example, is the actual activation for the minister spoke to the injured patients. And this is what our theoretical model generates. And you can see it's very close. We can very accurately tell which of 240 sentences a person's reading. It's 81 to 86% rank accuracy. It works very well.
Excuse me, Professor, just, I think your slide is stuck on the image of the video.
Oh my goodness.
Maybe you stop sharing and start sharing again.
Yes. Yeah, sorry about that. So this was the video. So these were the emotions. These are the three dimensions underlying the emotions: valence, good or bad, arousal or intensity, and whether or not there's a social interaction. Most recently, I was talking about the study of the comprehension, the processing of sentences, these short narrative sentences, like the girl saw a horse in the park. I asked what would the neurosemantic factors be, and what they are, as I said, was people, social interaction, right inferior frontal gyrus, places, parahippocampal place area, actions, motor and premotor, feelings, the locations for the emotions that occurred in the previous study. And here is the actual activation for the minister spoke to the injured patient. And here's the predicted activation from the theoretical model based on the neurosemantic representation. And the model, so here the decoding is extremely accurate, 81 to 86%. This is, as I said, this is the study that Cynthia Baylor was co-author on. It works across different languages. We train the model on Carnegie Mellon students reading some of these sentences. We then had monolingual Portuguese speaker read 60 of these sentences, and the model was able to identify which sentence the Portuguese monolinguals were reading based on their brain activation patterns, based on the brain activation patterns of the English speakers. So again, this is the language of the mind. It's not Portuguese or English. Let me talk a little bit about an educational application. And it has to do with the representation of scientific concepts, physics concepts. So here are 30 physics concepts. Instead of apples and hammers and things like that, we have magnetic field, heat transfer, gravity, energy, and so on. Okay. And let me ask you, what are the underlying neural dimensions of representation? Is it going to be how these interact with your body? No, not so much. Is it going to be valence? No, not so much. It's a whole new set of dimensions. And I'll tell you what, oh, and we do the usual, this is with Rob Mason. And, you know, one thing that really distinguishes this is I think that the human brain was really built to deal with concepts like apple and tools like hammer and so on, and enclosures like, you know, a hut or something. But the human brain wasn't really designed for science concepts per se, but it adapts. And I think the interesting thing is that new kinds of dimensions, well, kind of new dimensions built on top of old dimensions emerge for the representation of these physics concepts that you probably remember from your first physics course. And here they are. Here's the easiest one to explain: oscillation or periodicity. One of the factors that organizes one of the dimensions of meaning is whether it's, you know, a sine wave or a light wave or a sound wave, or frequency. This is one of the underlying dimensions. And as I said, Mother Nature did prepare us to see things like ripples in a pond, or the ebbing and flowing of a sound in the distance, and so on. And so we have these locations in the brain that code oscillation and periodicity, and it's one of the underlying dimensions of representation of these physics concepts. Another one, perhaps not surprising, is energy flow. And the items that load high on this are electric field, heat transfer, light, and so on. And now, did Mother Nature prepare us to deal with electric field? No, but Mother Nature did prepare us to deal with heat from a fire or from the sun. And we know the feeling of that energy being transferred to our bodies. And this is what gets coded when this is the underlying dimension to code these kinds of physics items. Another one here is causal motion visualization. This is motion that causes something, and the items that are strongly at the end of that dimension are gravity, potential energy, torque. And the third dimension is something that you think of in terms of an algebraic representation, an expression or equation, really like a sentence. So maybe acceleration is mass times velocity or something like that. Force equals ma. And so some of these things are coded at, some of these physics items are coded in terms of an expression or almost a linguistic representation. So the reason I say this is an educational possible application is because we teach things normally in terms of the domain of the discipline, but it's conceivable that we could change this to teach according to the brain's organization of these ideas or concepts. For example, we don't currently teach students in terms of periodicity or oscillation. Usually there's a course on heat or a chapter on heat, a chapter on light, a chapter on sound, and there's nothing to relate them to each other. But you could have a course in periodicity on waves and vibrations that would unite these areas and, more importantly, correspond to the way the brain organizes things. So my general point is that if you know how the brain organizes things, and you know that everybody's brain organizes things the same way, then you can organize instruction to teach to that organization. I also want to say briefly that this extends to abstract concepts like causality, consciousness, deity, spirituality, sacrilege, faith, acceleration, or you see some of the physics ones, gossip, intimidation. So obviously it's not going to be, it's not going to be enclosure or spatial setting here. It's going to be somewhat more abstract. I meant what would be the underlying factors for these kinds of concepts. I don't know if you can guess, but I'll certainly tell you what they are. One is externality or internality with respect to oneself. So at the external extreme is causality, sacrilege, and I think it's interesting that deity is external to oneself. Oh, and the reason I know this is because the neural regions where you code self-reference don't activate when you think about deity, sacrilege, or causality. However, at the other end of the extreme, when you think about spirituality, sadness, and consciousness, then the regions of the brain that are self-referential, that activate when you think about yourself, you see activation there. So one of the dimensions is internality, externality. Another dimension is whether it's social or not. So at the social extreme of these abstract concepts is pride, gossip, and equality. And the non-social extreme is heat, necessity, and multiplication. And finally, there's some abstract concepts that are thought of primarily in terms of other verbal concepts. So, and at the verbal extreme are faith, ethics, and truth. You can't find any other basis for them in the brain other than the meanings of other words. On the other hand, at the visuospatial extreme, gravity and force and acceleration absolutely are grounded in visual spatial representations in the parietal cortex. Briefly, well, you all know that, of course, psychiatric illnesses are change the way you think, and they change the way you think about some concepts. And we studied with David Brandt and other collaborators, we studied the concepts that might be altered in people who've been thinking about suicide. So the most obvious concepts to look at would be suicide and death, but we didn't stop there. We had, apathy, lifeless, suicide, death. We also had positive concepts like good, vitality, comfort, bliss, and negative concepts like evil, inferior, guilty, and worried. And we put people in a scanner, say, think about these concepts. And the question here isn't so much what are the underlying dimensions, but what distinguishes people who are thinking about suicide from people who aren't, from control subjects. And this time, the classifier's job isn't to tell us so much which concept they're thinking about, but to tell us whether the person in the scanner has been thinking about suicide or not. And it does extremely well. It gets 91% accuracy of these 34 people. And here are the concepts that are best discriminate between the two groups. So death, cruelty, and trouble, perhaps you're not surprised at those, but also carefree, good, and praise. And very roughly, let me just summarize that what distinguishes the people who are suicidal is when they think about death, cruelty, and trouble, there's a very strong identification with the self, much more than in the control subjects. And it's the opposite for carefree, good, and praise. There's very little identification with the self among the suicidal people, and strong identification among the controls. So it's not just death and negative concepts, but also positive concepts that are altered. I've told you what the differences are. These are the brain locations. There's an anterior and a posterior area that are particularly associated with self-referential thought. The left, the superior medial frontal, and the anterior cingulate. Those are the self areas that I keep referring to. And there's another different, well, the concept of death. I told you I have templates for shame, for the emotions, shame and sadness, for example. Well, when the person who's suicidal thinks of death, there's more shame there than when a control person thinks of death. I could show you another video. Yes, of these. No, I'm going to skip the video. So more recently, as I said, we have people read things like acoustics is the study of how sound is transmitted, such as reverberation in enclosed space. So this is like, I don't know, maybe 70 words or so. And we can now code the neural representation of a paragraph like this in terms of underlying dimensions, how much various dimensions play a role. And we then have a model that tries to match up this passage to 786 Wikipedia articles. And in this case, for example, it takes 786 guesses and it gets it right on the fourth guess. It says acoustics. The first guess isn't bad, audible frequency vibrations. The second guess isn't bad, loss of hearing, moisture is off, but it gets it on the fourth guess. By matching up, it gets we can compute the sort of the factors of 786 Wikipedia articles, and we match up the factors from this passage and see which of the 786 it matches best, and you can see this. So when a person is reading and understanding a passage, these various dimensions of representation come into play, and that's how that knowledge becomes understood and stored. I'm going to skip, in the interest of time, a discussion of autism. We can also diagnose autism. This, I think, is my final slide. And it's sort of it's from several studies. I've talked about emotions. I've talked about concrete objects. I've talked about narrative sentences. I've talked about elementary physics concepts. I haven't done this. and I've talked about abstract concepts. So here you see 6 times 3, 18 neurosemantic factors so far. I think the brain codes the world in terms of factors like these. I don't think 18 is enough. This is just from the experiments we run. I don't know how many we need, maybe 50, maybe 100, but I think this is how the brain codes the world. And this is what we get when we read, when we think, when we talk to other people. These are the dimensions with which we code meaning. So I think this is an interesting juxtaposition, intersection between cognitive neuroscience, language science, clinical neuroscience, and psychology, of course. Understanding how we use our brains to make our way through the world, understand the world, and express our understanding of the world. So I think I'm going to stop there, a little bit over, but I'd like to leave some time for possible questions. So let me stop there, and thank you again for your interest in this topic, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Marcel, for your, was not just interesting, it's just amazing. And I think everyone, I could see, the passion in you for this. So, and it's really amazing. Yes, really. So thank you very much. So Cynthia Dyler is going to moderate the session. So I'm just going to say a few words. Cynthia, in fact, she has an MA, both an MA and a PhD from our graduate program in language studies, specifically in the area of reading. And she was 1 year in the CAPES sandwich program, a sandwich program, it's called. So 1 year abroad, and she was there with Marcel for a year, developing the study that Marcel mentioned. And she has professional experience in the teaching of English. And as a researcher, she's interested in the area of psycholanguage acquisition with a focus on cognitive aspects involved in the language processing comprehension, with special attention to reading and the implementation of these processes in the brain. And she's also in the area of education and working with L2 teacher education. So Cynthia, I'll give you the floor now so that you can moderate the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Leda, for this amazing opportunity to be here, like virtually, right? We would like to be all together face to face, right? But that's the mode we can have Dr. Marcel Just here with us. So thank you, Dr. Just, for sharing with us all your expertise in a very summarized way, right? All the amazing research you guys have been conducting there at Carnegie Mellon, and also bringing to us the latest research, the latest results. So we see that theory is being built there, right? So it's so amazing to see your conclusion regarding the way the brain codes the world, right, into these factors. And my role here is to mediate the questions. So people have been putting some questions on the chat, Dr. Just, so I will read them to you. So Dr. Lillian Hubner, she's saying, have your groups or any other try to apply this study to neurodegenerative diseases such as MCI and Alzheimer's to analyze, for instance, the difference between living and non-living items which are affected in AD, and also in psychopathologies. These studies could have a nice application. She thanks you.
This is a perfect question. So of course you're referring to Elizabeth Warrington's work on patients who fail to distinguish living and non-living. So now in my terms, I'm absolutely certain, I would bet anything that one of the codings in our studies is living, non-living. So we studied physics, but if we happened to be studying biology, almost certainly living, non-living would be a dimension. And what Warrington's work showed was that in certain neurodegenerative diseases, it used to be called Pick's disease, it's now called frontotemporal dementia. So, patients lose the ability to make that distinction. So there, as I said, there are brain locations that code these dimensions. Not a single, in our experience, it's 3 or 4 locations, but certainly if you have atrophy in one of these locations, you would lose the dimension. And I think that's exactly how, I'm sure that's probably what you were referring to. You know, yes, there was a postdoctoral fellow, a bright woman named Jing Wang, who I think Cynthia knows, and she wanted to study, she exactly proposed this, and she went to the Alzheimer's Disease Center at the University of Pittsburgh and said, I'd like to do this, do you have a pool of subjects? And they said, we have, it was a grossly inadequate pool. She wanted frontotemporal patients have exactly a semantic deficit, and they had like 3 or 4, and she needed like 10 or 15. But yes, that was exactly the idea. So I don't know much more about frontotemporal dementia than that, but I think that it affects those parts of the brain that code some of these semantic dimensions. I'm not, and I think that Alzheimer's is maybe slightly too heterogeneous, but maybe not. If I had a choice of which population to try this on, I would prefer frontotemporal dementia.
Thank you, Dr. Just, for your answer. Lillian is nodding, so I think she's satisfied. Yeah. There's another question here from Tatiana. She's thanking you for your talk, and she asks, what are the implications of your research to working memory and long-term memory distinction or interaction?
Well, I'm not sure, maybe you're, I'm not sure what to say about the distinction. Certainly, if you have one of these concepts in working memory, I'm fairly confident that the relevant semantic dimension is activated. And so it must be there in long-term memory as well. You could ask, how does it get to long-term memory in the first place? How does it get learned? And there, there's a bit of magic that I can't explain. I don't think anyone can. But when you learn something new, it ends up going to the right place in the brain. As I said, you learn a new concept, and we do this. You teach a new concept, and it goes to the right places in the brain and the same ones in everyone. And you could ask, how does each part of the brain know that it's responsible for coding X or Y? And I don't think this is really that we have a good explanation. But suppose you're learning a concept that's, for example, has spatial knowledge. In one of our experiments, we taught organic chemistry concepts. And of course, there's the spatial configuration of the concepts that subjects had to learn. And this, of course, was coded in the parietal area, in the intraparietal sulcus. And how did it know to go there? I think this is just speculation, but my speculation is that when new information is input for the first time that hasn't been previously coded, all all the coding regions try their hand at it, and whichever one sort of has a fit or previous experience or has been reinforced for that kind of information, it gets to keep it. So maybe, maybe a verbal area, yes. And, and it's the way that some computer systems work, where you put out many things on a channel or on a bus, but only the designated destinations pull it off the bus. So that's how Ethernet works. Ethernet doesn't send something to one particular destination. It just puts everything on with a label, and if a destination has a match to that label, it takes it. So I'm proposing that these labels, roughly speaking, are like these dimensions that I'm talking about, and that's how things get coded in long-term memory. I didn't say anything about, well, I think obviously the hippocampus plays a role in this, and all I can say is that when you're learning a new concept, you can decode that concept from the hippocampal activation. So this organization, I think, certainly applies to long-term memory. I think that's what we're testing. I think it applies to the hippocampus when you're learning, and it certainly applies to working memory. That's what we're using in our experiments. I don't think that, I don't think that's a direct answer to the fundamental question, namely the working memory, long-term memory distinction. I'm not sure that, I think that the coding with respect to these factors crosses that distinction.
That's cool. Yeah, there are some other questions popping up here. There's a question from YouTube, from Edilson. He's saying, have all these classifications, concrete, affective, and scientific concepts, been based on naive-based classifiers?
I can't see it in the chat, but okay. What about the use of Gaussian naive Bayes? Well, the reason we use GNB, Gaussian naive Bayes, is just because it's easy, fast, expedient.
Mm-hmm.
You can use support vector machines. It really is very similar. It's not very classifier specific. Sometimes one classifier is a little bit more accurate than the other, but the notion of a classification is just multivariate analysis. And this is not GNB specific at all.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure, I didn't read the question. I hope have all these classes been based on, yes, so everything we reported is GNB. That was the question.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. There's another one. Could you recommend an article about the 18 neurosemantic factors discovered so far? Carolina is asking this one.
I've never put them together in a paper. It's only, I give talks like this, and I iterate through, 6 experiments. And it recently occurred to me that these accumulate into a factor space. And really, I shouldn't be decoding words within their own little domain. Mm-hmm. I should be decoding them within the whole space. And so this slide that had the 18 factors is an initial attempt at characterizing the space. And you have to 6 individual papers, sorry. And the papers are all available for downloading on our website. I could bring up the address again if you'd like.
Yeah. I think that's a nice idea to concentrate everything. People will be happy reading that. Dr. Lillian has another question here. Not a question, a suggestion, sorry. Would be studying the semantic variant of primary progressive aphasia to see the role of the anterior temporal lobe and how it interacts to word type dimensions.
So So I think I know a little bit about aphasia. I can't remember. Did it say Broca's aphasia?
She
No.
said PPA,
Yeah.
the primary progressive aphasia.
Yeah, it's a neurodegenerative disease. Yeah, it's not a.
Yeah.
That affects specifically semantic aspects. So it could be interesting.
So if my speculation is correct, it should be particularly damaging to the representation of abstract concepts, because that's the exclusive or the main way that some abstract concepts are represented.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you know, that area, the formulation in linguistic terms plays many roles. For example, it plays a role in the physics concepts, where some concepts are thought of in terms of the equation. And that could be, you know, that's kind of a linguistic representation that could be affected by that. So I think that the anterior, this is the anterior temporal lobe. I'm sorry, I was thinking about the inferior frontal gyrus. Anterior temporal lobe. I'm sorry, I misread the question.
Okay.
The anterior temporal lobe, according to some theorists, is a sort of a semantic hub.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And so I'm not sure that we need a semantic hub, but where different elements are integrated, perhaps. So I'm not sure I have much to say about the anterior temporal lobe. When thoughts and meaning are kind of word focused, you see activation there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure it's at the heart of meaning. I think it's sort of bringing, maybe it's correct to say that it's a hub, maybe bringing elements of meaning together.
It's possible.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah. So I should go to the other question by Professor Leda. So forensic linguistics help courts decide whether someone is guilty of a crime that has been committed. Do you think studies in neurosemantics can help predict whether someone is liable to committing a crime?
So, you know, there's a film that was made. Oh, were you here for it?
Yes.
It's not, so you know,
I watched it there.
It's not a very great film. It's entitled Justice is Mind.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it starts off saying, you know, in 2008, a laboratory at Carnegie Mellon did this and so on.
Yeah.
And the main part of the story is about a murder that was committed, and a forensic neuroscientist is asked to dig out of the accused person's brain whether they did it or not, because, you know, they presumably have a record of whether they committed the murder or not. The science fiction, it's set in 2025. Of course, 2025 is getting closer and closer. So do I think it could be used forensically? I think that's very far in the future. It's very nice if a classifier gets 86% correct, but I would hate to send somebody to prison for an 86% correct score. I mean, I'd want a little bit higher than that. So it's still very imprecise, but the principle, I think the principle is there. I think, you know, many laws take into account intentionality and certainly memory, and that exists in people's brains. And someday, I think, you know, instead of putting someone on the witness stand, I think it will be possible to examine the contents of their brain and see what they did, see what they intended, and so on. Not by 2025, but I mean, the information exists. We know it's in electromagnetic form. It's absolutely there. or was there at one time. I don't know what happens to it over time. So I think we will be technically, it should be possible. I'm not sure I'm enthusiastic about doing that, our legal system, such as it is. Yeah, I would not like to be tried that way these days, but I think in principle, the information is there. So things like, like witnesses, eyewitnesses. Now they tell you, I think I saw this person or I didn't see this person. Well, in principle, you might be able to go back and find out who they saw or what they thought at the time. So yes, I think it presents a very interesting possibility, forensics for the future. And, people often ask me, what about interrogation techniques? So you capture someone who's planted a bomb and you want to know where it is. Can you get the location out? So in principle, yes. And if you could make them think of the location, you might be able to decode it. It's a horrible invasion of personhood to go into a person's brains. And, I'd be the last person to advocate that. I don't advocate that. I think it would be, the ultimate invasion of a person that shouldn't occur. But I think the information could be there.
That's really interesting, right? To think about all these implications and possibilities for the future, right? Also, Tatiana has asked here, have there been studies in neurosemantics with children?
My lab hasn't done any, and I don't, and not many labs do studies like this. So I think the answer, straight answer is no. But you could ask, are there studies with children that reveal these dimensions of meaning? And, I haven't had a chance to think about it, but I think it's possible that that's true. There are certainly studies of semantics with children. How they composition of multi-word phrases like lemon truck. That's been studied, but I don't know. No study like this. You would expect these dimensions to emerge gradually, like the body-object interaction. It's got to be there very, very, very early. They know that they kick a soccer ball and they hold a hammer very early on, and that's got to be coded. The more abstract things like energy flow, maybe later. Periodicity, oscillation. Well, I don't know the order in which they come in. Well, there's a certain order in which vocabulary comes in, with which I'm not all that familiar. But of course, there are atlases of children's growth of vocabulary items, and you could see whether they come in by dimension. Certainly, infrequent words come in later, but that's not the relevant point. The point is that maybe certain, children probably don't code certain dimensions. So I think that would be an interesting kind of library project to look at the dimensions of words that children acquire at different ages.
Yeah, possibilities for studies popping up.
Also, for teaching kids, I used to be taught vocabulary words, and I don't know how the teacher chose which vocabulary words to teach, but you could teach them, as I said, to the brains of children in terms of the dimensions that they have ready to consume these various concepts and words.
Yeah, the way the brain codes information to be more effective, right? There's a question here from Mirella. She's asking how hippocampal function is believed to be highly impacted by stress. How can semantic representations early in their encoding processes, for example, in the early years become impaired by stress or stressful situations like the times we're living in?
So I don't know what stress does to hippocampal function. And we know there's typically a degradation of cognitive function with stress, of most aspects of cognitive function. So I don't know. I wouldn't, would the more abstract dimensions be less available? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how stress would affect the representation of meaning. Would the more familiar dimensions dominate? No, I just don't, I'm afraid I don't know. I don't have an answer.
Yeah, no clue. We need more research for that. Yeah, let me see if we have any other question here. I think I have asked all of them from the chat. Lilian, do you have any other? Leda?
Can I just say something directly instead of
Writing.
Marcel? I was so happy that I lived to actually hear meaning comes from the brain. I'm so happy. You know why? In my interview for the university, one of the members of the committee, she was really upset because I was defending meaning is not in the text. I was trying to explain the importance of prior knowledge and all that, and this person could not accept it. So, I really wish, I think I'm gonna send the link for her to see. You're beginning to talk, meaning comes from the brain. So you made my day. Thank you very much.
Well, we see animals obviously represent meaning to some degree without language.
Yeah.
They have meaning in their brains, more limited, I suspect. They're not so good at physics. Although they have some physics abilities that are better than ours in some ways.
Can I say something too? So instead of writing, it goes faster. So while well, thanks again for this brilliant talk. It was amazing. And many questions and issues and further research ideas popped up in our minds, for sure. Different applications, like for instance, in psycholinguistics, in the psycholinguistics field, for instance, the role of age of acquisition in the words, living, non-living, all these aspects that you have already mentioned. In pragmatics, when we talk about embodiment, because it seems that words that are associated to movement, to doing something with this word, with this noun, is important because it's this embodiment, let's say, it seems that the word is better drenched, let's say, in the neurons in different areas, not only verb, it's a mixture of verbs and nouns, yeah. And emotions, I read already that some people advocate that the emotional aspect is more important than the frequency when we talk about words. It's another dimension that should be observed. The previous experience that we had with that word, it may make it more represented, stronger represented in our brain. And something else, just to finish, that also I thought on is the tip of the tongue phenomenon, because many times we don't know if the person has just a difficulty in accessing the word, the concept, or if the concept is still there and it's just the bridge that broke down, you cannot, the lexicon is missing, but the meaning, the semantic area is still there, the semantic meaning is still there. So many ideas for investigating. So thank you very much again.
Yeah, that's amazing, right? And just to make a comment, right? Thinking about multilinguals, bilinguals, right? So your research has shown that the brain has, or we have a language of the mind, right? So training the classifiers on data from different languages, we can decode what a person in another language is thinking about. So this is awesome, right? To know that we have a common basis for the representation of concepts, like very contrary to what many people thought of before. So this is a huge contribution, especially for us, very interested in how bilinguals and multilinguals represent the knowledge, how they learn, and how they can become better proficient at languages. So a huge thank you for the whole opportunity of conducting research there. So this is a personal thank you for accepting my craziness of trying to find people, monolingual Brazilian speakers of Portuguese there. So it was a huge challenge.
You're a wonderful guest.
Thank you. I get emotional. So thank you very much for your enlightening talk. And as I can see here on the chat, so I think questions are over, right? Did I miss something? That is helping me here on the questions on YouTube here.
So maybe, I don't know, Leda, before then closing, can I just say some words about the incoming talks? We would like to thank you very much, everybody on YouTube and here in Zoom, the audience who's watching us. And I would like just to announce the incoming speeches, talks. On June 16th, we will have Dr. Davi Oliveira from the State University of Bahia. And the title is Ferramentas Web para Investigação em Leitura e Cognição, Web Tools for the Investigation in Reading and Cognition. And then on July the 8th, we will have Dr. Charlene Newman from the University of Alabama. And her talk is about how does the brain accommodate multiple languages. Then on August the 20th, Dr. Brandon Weeks from the University of Hong Kong. And his talk will be on writing in contact and in conflict. And on September the 15th, we'll welcome Dr. Denise Newman from the University of Auckland. And her talk is entitled Antenatal and Perinatal Risk Factors for Receptive Language and Executive Control in Preschool Children. So these are some of the following the next talks in our series of conferences. Thank you again. So I don't know, Leda.
Okay, so thank you very much, Marcel, once again. I think all of us, we're going to leave here, just having experienced this amazing talk. It was very, very nice. Thank you. Thank you also to the audience and YouTube and also here. So, and all the talks, they are, in fact, they're going to be there in PPG's channel on YouTube. They're going to be recorded there. So if you want to go back or tell other people who were not able to be here today. So thank you. Thank you, Marcel. Thank you, Cynthia, for having accepted to moderate the talk. Thank you, Lilia, for going on this with me. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Harissa, our technician.
Thank you, Harissa.
Thank you. Bye-bye. See you
Bye.
next time.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Pleasure meeting you.